I wonder if you have ever been the victim of a scam. These days, there are so many ways that scams can happen, whether it is an email warning you of an unpaid bill that needs urgent payment using this link, or a phone call trying to get you to give away your personal information, or that bargain online purchase that never quite arrives. I was victim to that last one just before Christmas last year. With the help of technology, scams can now be executed on a large scale. And we might be wondering what is becoming of our world. I'm not sure if it is entirely reassuring or not that scams are nothing new, and they are not marking some recent moral decline in humanity, but one that has ancient roots. Scams seem to have been around for as long as trade has. The prophet Amos, writing around 750 BC, was all too aware of the way some people would adjust their weights and measures slightly in their own favour, bulk out their good wheat with the sweepings of the chaff, and exploit the poor and needy. Scams and shady business practices are nothing new. And long even before Amos, going back into early Babylon or Sumerian eras, some of the earliest writings we have are legal codes. The mark of a good kingdom was one where laws were consistently enforced. And those early codes recognized both the innate human desire for fairness and justice on the one hand, and the innate human tendency to try and gain the system for a quick buck, if you can get away with it, on the other hand. I am sure that within Jesus' audience there would have been both those who had been the victim of scams or exploitation, as well as those who had perpetuated it. As Eve reminded us in the intercessions, today is the feast day of St. Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples who, in a previous life, was a tax collector, tax collectors being notorious for taking a little extra to fatten their own purses. To this mixed group of disciples and Pharisees and other hangers-on, Jesus tells a particularly cryptic parable, often entitled The Shrewd Manager. Whenever we have a Matins service, it feels like the readings were quite a long time ago by the time we get to the sermon. So let me recap for those who aren't so familiar with the story. There was a rich man who had a manager for his land and heard the manager was squandering his property. He summoned the manager and asked for an account. The manager, realizing he was not strong enough to dig and too ashamed to beg, hit upon a cunning plan to buy himself some popularity. Summoning his master's debtors, he asked them how much they owed and quickly asked them to take their bill and make it less. And his master, when he returned, commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. What on earth are we meant to make of this? In one of the commentaries I was reading about this parable, Jane Williams wrote that this story reads like something that has been wrongly remembered or had its punchline forgotten or something. Perhaps the original audience even didn't quite understand it. But if you read this story as deliberately ironic and unsettling, it begins to make a bit more sense. So, if we do as Jane suggests, and accept that this parable is meant to be a bit unsettling, perhaps we can dig into it a little deeper, being prepared that it might unsettle us too. We might notice, for example, that we're not quite sure where our sympathies are meant to lie in this parable. In most of Jesus' parables, there's a kind of obvious goodie and a baddie, or a clear moral superior. But not with this one. We start with a rich landowner who, in Jesus' day, were usually viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Again, something that has perhaps not changed too much in the intervening couple of thousand years. Jesus' original audience would probably have had far more sympathy for the manager than for the rich absentee landlord, and might wonder whether the manager had been falsely accused, because it's not clear that he had actually done anything wrong. However, whether he had done anything wrong before, once the manager realizes he's going to lose his job, he fully embraces the role of swindler that he has been cast as. He calls the debtors and reduces their debt, buying their friendship and favor. And the role of the debtor is an interesting one. They are told to sit down and quickly rewrite their debts. Notably, neither of them seem to raise any concerns or questions about this strange turn of events. They happily participate, even though they surely can't have thought it was entirely above board. But hey, the rich man probably won't even miss it anyway, right? It would be crazy to turn down the chance to reduce our debts for nothing. When the rich man realizes what the manager has done, we should expect there to be a reckoning. In most of Jesus' other parables, where there's a king or a master that comes back, there's usually a firm hand or some firm words. So we would expect the manager to be dragged to court or forced to compensate the rich man. But there's another twist. The rich man commends the manager for his shrewd behaviour. He seems to simply accept what has happened. Maybe he's pleased that he had at least employed someone shrewd rather than someone naive who might have been taken advantage of. Or maybe the rich man had himself made his money by similar shady practices and didn't begrudge someone else trying their luck. We don't know what happened next, whether the manager was rehired or the cancelled debts were reinstated, or whether those favours that the manager had bought actually paid dividends. Did he have any friends, really? And we are left unsure whose side we are meant to be on in this parable, because none of the characters seem to come out well. At the end of the parable, Jesus seems to encourage his disciples to be as shrewd as the manager, but without falling into the trap of worshipping money and wealth. Jesus is not saying that we should stop using money or withdraw from economic activity. Rather, that we must not get caught up in putting economic gain ahead of serving God. And we should do that not just in the big things, but even in the little things. Indeed, it is in those little things where we can perhaps most easily be tempted to cut a corner. Because it won't really hurt anyone, and it's unlikely to be noticed. It's not a big deal, and it probably wouldn't be noticed by anyone except ourselves and God. I asked at the start if you have ever been the victim of a scam or the recipient of some shady practices. Perhaps the harder question to answer is whether we have ever been complicit in those same practices. Or maybe that's not such a hard question, because in reality, I doubt many, if any of us, could say that we are completely perfect in this regard. We all live in a moral grey area a lot of the time. in a society that tells us to take what we can when we can get it. And even if we approach everything with the best intentions, we won't always get it right. We might not act like the manager, intentionally cheating someone, but we might have acted like the debtors, not asking too many questions when the odds happen to fall in our favour. It is easy to buy cheap clothes without wondering too much about the conditions in which they were made, to contribute to climate change through our consumption when we won't be the first to feel its effects, to put our investments into the best performing stocks regardless of their ethics, to ignore injustices which don't directly affect us. I say that not to point the finger at anyone, but to acknowledge the reality in which we live and the challenge of living in a global economy where we are often far removed from the consequences of our actions or inactions. So what might it look like to be shrewd with regard to money without falling into the trap of serving it? Well, instead of chasing after money, wondering how we can increase our own sense of security and wealth, we can perhaps instead ask how we can use money, where we might put it to benefit others rather than just ourselves. Oddly, the parable gives us an example of this, the manager using money to buy favours. Well, what might happen if we used our money wisely and shrewdly? What might we invest it in? Coming back to some of our earlier examples, perhaps we might pay a little more for our clothes to ensure the people making them get a fair wage. Perhaps we might buy less, but buy from companies who invest in sustainable production and maybe charge a bit more as a result. Perhaps we might add our voice to campaigns for justice and donate to fund them, or give to charities working with the most vulnerable. Or perhaps we might think about where we literally invest our savings and pensions, choosing the investments that are most ethical, even if they are not perhaps the most profitable. I'm sure you will think of other ways in which our money can be used to make a positive change in the world. Jesus was not asking his disciples to ignore money, but rather to be aware of its power. Power that can often sneak in without us noticing. Money has power. It did in Jesus' time, and it still does today. But instead of letting it have power over us, let us find ways to use that power for good and for the growth of God's kingdom. Amen.